Hello, this is Shane Coughlin, General Manager of OpenChain. Welcome everyone. I am going to start our recording on this call in a moment. For those of you who are new to OpenChain, welcome. We are very glad to have you here. For those of you who are old hands at OpenChain, welcome back. It's good to have you on board. This new webinar series we'll be running will hopefully provide a lot of information that we would have got at events around the world in the past. Alrighty. So I'm having a look at our participant list. We currently have 20 people on the line. We also have some other people in the old Uber conference, and I'm just letting them know that they have to move over. So this is a message to anyone on the old Uber conference line. I'm sharing my screen to you with the dial-in details to Zoom. It's important to log into Zoom to get our presentation. All right. So back to our current call. And now everyone is on mute at the moment. So if you want to talk, you should unmute yourself. And we're going to have two presentations today. One of the presentations today is Nikolay talking about supply chain governance. Another presentation today will be Armine talking about container compliance. To give some context of what we're doing, you should think of this like a radio show. We are going to have some guests on our show. You're the audience, and you have already dialed in. At any point, you can jump in, ask a question, and at any point, once we get to Q&A, you can provide not just some notes on what the presenter said, but also some of your experience around the particular issue at hand. So, Nikolay, I believe you're on the line. You're currently muted. So if you could unmute yourself, welcome.
Thank you. Can you hear me well?
Yeah, I've got you pretty well. Does everyone else feel good? All right.
Silence either means that
Exactly.
you can't hear me or
no.
hear me well.
In OpenChain, we have a very strict rule that silence means agreement. And,
cool.
This is used to leverage all types of results.
Perfect. And someone just texted in the chat that audio is okay. So,
yeah, perfect. Alrighty, so Nikolay, you've got between 10 and 15 minutes to do a presentation on supply chain governance. This information is based on your doctorate research. You spent several years going through an analysis that I believe was a bit of a hybrid between qualitative and quantitative analysis. We're quite lucky to get your results here. As you and our audience knows, OpenChain is all about supply chain. We're exclusively focused on making sure that the companies in the supply chain have the key requirements of quality open source compliance in place. But we never lose sight of the fact that governance is a very big field and we need to have proper context. So Nikolay, I'm going to hand over to you to do your presentation. And, you know, if people jump in with a question or comment, I hope that's okay. And when you wrap up, we'll give a space at the end for people to also give questions or comments, or indeed just provide their input on the fields that we covered. So I'll hand over to you now. I believe you should have screen share ability. It should be on the bottom of the screen, and off you go.
Thank you very much, Shane. And thanks everyone for joining. So I hope you can see my screen now. I'm still learning, how to use Zoom very well. And this is my first radio dial-in interview. So it's going to be interesting. But yeah, thanks a lot for the introduction, Shane. And I remember when we first talked in 2016. Okay, so I remember first when we had our first call with Dirk and with you, Shane, in 2016. I was just starting with my PhD and you were just starting with OpenChain. It was very interesting how starting from then, or 3 years, I've been doing my PhD. I just finished last year and now I'll be talking about the results. But OpenChain has grown to be such a great community with so many incredible people there. So I'm very, very glad to have been following it for over 3 years now. So I'm glad to be presenting my findings now. And if you have questions, please jump in or you can ask afterwards also. So my topic when I was doing my PhD was about corporate open source governance of software supply chains. The focus was on companies using open source components in their products and open supply chain management, software supply chains. This was one of the focal topics, but not the only topic. And you will see some of the other topics in my talk today. And right now I'm still at the university where I was doing my PhD, finishing up some more projects on open source governance, but also other topics in Erlangen, Nuremberg in Germany at the University of Nuremberg. So let's get started. So first, let's start a bit with the motivation. Why did I choose this topic in the beginning? It was obvious to me, to my professor, to other people who we were working with, and just to say I'm still at the professorship for open source software. So in Nuremberg, in this small university, we have a professorship for open source software, which is pretty cool, I think. So we realized that open source use is on the rise. More and more companies are using open source, but many of them have no idea how to properly use it. So some developer might know a license or two, but this was by no means a governed proper use of open source components. There were a lot of risks, like non-compliance with the licenses, but many other risks also. And so what we asked in our research, so I won't bore you too much with research, but the research question that we had was, how should companies be using this open source components in their products, and how should they govern this use based on industry best practices? Why did we look at the industry best practices? Well, we started by the literature, like researchers do, but there wasn't a lot of literature on the topic. And so we had to look beyond literature, beyond the existing research. We went to the industry experts. What we did is we chose 21 experts in the industry in different companies who already knew what they are doing when it comes to open source, to using open source in their products, to governing it, to looking at the licenses, to looking at the copyright, to dealing with export restrictions, and many other aspects, including the supply chain management. And so we chose those experts from companies with different profiles. I have a slide here about the sampling we did. What we essentially did is we looked at companies that differ from each other, but the one common thing was that they all were proficient, had good awareness of open source governance. They had some practices in place. Most of them already had some type of an open source program office in place that was managing different aspects of open source governance and working with the developers, with managers, with lawyers in the companies. So they knew what they were doing. This was the common thing, but apart from that, they were quite different. There was a consulting company, a medium-sized one, with enterprise customers, and we had many more dimensions. I just don't have them all here on this slide. There were some automotive companies, there were some enterprise software companies, many other companies actually. So 21 experts from those companies, and we also had some primary materials like some guidelines that companies like Google would share and tell us about their approach for dealing with open source use and governance. And what we did next was to gather all this data and analyze it. We did QDA, qualitative data analysis, where we basically read through all these materials and our interviews and data we collected, and iteratively tried to find the common patterns, the themes that the industry thought are important when dealing with open source governance. And eventually those themes became big parts of our theory, big parts of our findings, but then we went into more specifics of each of those larger fields, and I'll be talking about that a bit today. And one of those large fields categories is supply chain management. So this is the result. Of course, you know, it was a scientific work, so it was a theory in the end, an abstraction of all these different best practices we found from the industry. But I'm not going to go into the details of the theory part of it, more just talking about the practical results. And this was actually a goal of ours from the very beginning. We didn't want to have only theoretical findings in the end. We wanted to have something practical that a company, preferably any company that's using open source components in their products, they could just take and use, of course, modify it a little, but use our findings without going into the depth of different papers that we published. And so we had these categories coming out from our findings, from our results. So we had the getting started part. We found this is quite important because lots of companies don't know how to start with open source governance. They already have some open source components because some developer along the way added them and is maintaining them or not, but they don't have an idea how to have a structured governance in place. So this was our first focus, and we tried to find out how did these expert companies, these experts get started in their companies with open source governance. Then the next subcategory was inbound governance, which was about how to approve a certain component, how to find an open source component, how do you reuse a component that you already found and you're already using, and so on. Another topic of inbound governance was supply chain management, but it was such a large topic and so important to us that we decided to have it as a separate category. And here we dealt with all the aspects of supply chain management, including certification, which could be OpenChain certification, for instance, that companies could ask for from their suppliers, but it also includes different aspects of preventive governance, corrective governance. What do you do to deal with the issues in supply chain once they arise already, and so on. Then the next topic was outbound governance, which was about when you already ship your product or you're about to, how do you deal with open source governance aspects of that, and a general governance which covered all the other aspects that we didn't cover in the other categories. And so this is a small mind map that shows all those categories and some of the major subcategories of theirs. I'm not going to go into too much detail here, just want to give you a quick overview. And then this is about supply chain management. This is more specific to what we're talking about today and what OpenChain community is working on. So I'm going to cover some small part of this, but obviously I only have 10 minutes. So I won't be able to go into too much detail. So these are the main categories of industry best practices we found. It was to create a policy, then to have a process for supply chain management that operationalizes this process. And then we have some specific categories like preventive governance. What do you do to prevent any issues related to open source governance? Related to your suppliers, like how do you select the right supplier? What type of certification do you ask? How do you design a contract with the supplier? And then there are some corrective aspects like risk assessment or risk mitigation if you already have some issue. Then the bill of materials management is another large one. How do you track all the metadata that you have for the different open source components you're using? What type of standard format should you use? Should you automate parts of it? And finally, we have license compliance specific issues. And this is actually what the result was of our findings. It's not only a theory, but also a handbook for open source governance and compliance. And in this handbook, in a very practical manner, we put in the different best practices we found from the industry in an interconnected manner, where from one best practice you can go to another one just by clicking through, and you can go through basically some type of a template process that we suggest. A company who would like to use our findings, they could just look at our process. Here you can see the template process, and they could then customize it to their needs and have it match their company design or their company processes. And you'll see how we use this handbook format to evaluate our theory, to evaluate our findings. But now I'm going to show you a couple of examples briefly of some subcategories in supply chain management part of our findings. So here we talk about bill of materials management, and these are some of the best practices that we found from talking to all these experts and reading the guidelines that we found from expert companies. And so, for example, number 4 is to use machine readable and standard format for bill of materials upon software supply. This is a best practice. We try to keep it short and actionable. But then when you look into the handbook or into my dissertation, you can find more details, like who should do this, the actor, open source program office might be the one doing it, or supply chain management responsible. We have these abstract terms because in different companies, the roles are different, but we wanted to have some abstract solution that would apply to essentially any company that's using open source in their products. So there is a context to the best practice. And in this case, you're trying to identify open source components and metadata from the supply chain. And how do you do this? How do you improve the bill of materials management? So one suggestion that we found that many experts encouraged was to establish a machine readable and standard format for bill of materials management within the company. And an example of such a format is SPDX. And I'm sure many of you know SPDX and are using it or are developing it. So this was one of the recommendations we heard over and over again, and we added it as a best practice. And then later on, we explained why and how to do this in more detail. Another best practice is about preventive governance, another subcategory of supply chain management. And let's take a look at 1.2, request supplier certification and self-certification. In this best practice, the company is trying to assess open source governance and compliance, awareness and maturity for a potential supplier. And the question is, how do they do this so that it works on a large scale with a bunch of suppliers? And the recommendation we find is to, among other things, to ask for a certification from your suppliers. And this could be a self-certification, or it could be a certification provided by a third party or by an independent company. And at that time, when we were doing the analysis, OpenChain was offering only self-certification. So that's why here we have it as an example of currently available self-certification. We suggest OpenChain, which is, one at that time was the leading one that was only providing self-certification. But now you obviously know OpenChain does much more than self-certification. There is also the third party provided certification, or the independent companies provide certification. And this would also fit into this best practice. And people would be able to use OpenChain to fulfill this requirement. And so just to briefly also, cover the evaluation, because we came up with all these best practices, but how do we know it's not just something we came up with, we dreamt up? It's not. We decided to evaluate it using case studies. And there were these 3 companies that we worked with. One was 2.5 years, and the other one was 1, and the other one was almost 1 year. And we worked with those 3 companies to evaluate our findings. We took parts of our handbook to each of them and had them actually implement our best practices. And while they were doing it, we were observing and seeing how this actually improves their management, their governance when it comes to open source use in their products. And so with company B specifically, we worked on supply chain management best practices, and we gave them that part of the handbook, they implemented it, and we would go back from time to time to see what they are doing. And one thing was quite inspiring when we saw that a couple of months after getting our handbook, they actually created a SPDX requirements document for their suppliers, and they sent it to their suppliers. And as a researcher, you can imagine it was pretty good when some company is actually using your research and is applying it. It's not only in papers, but it actually brings some additional value to the industry. So we were very happy to see it. I was very happy about it. And among other things, they also were considering using OpenChain eventually and asking for certification from their suppliers. So this was quite a cool thing to see how the research that we did was also actionable in the end. Yeah, That's it. So thanks a lot. Now, if you want to hear or to see much more about this, what I was talking about, you can check out my dissertation. And the link is here, and the QR code takes you there as well. But I have to warn you, it's quite long. It's more than 500 pages long. So there is a pro tip for you. You can skip to the appendix. Appendix is also long. It's 150 pages long, but it is kind of a condensed view of all the best practices, not all, but an excerpt of some of the best practices that came out of our work. So you can read those, and they are in a larger context there, including focusing on supply chain management. Or you can just write me and we can chat if you have any questions. If you have questions now, you're also welcome to ask them. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much, Nikolay. So everyone, you are currently on mute. So you'll need to unmute yourself to ask a question. For those of you who joined us a little bit later, welcome. We have a total of 47 people on the line, so quite a few people. Questions very welcome. No particular methodology for giving the questions, just hop in. And I'll just get started, Nikolay, with one particular question. How applicable do you think this research is to very different geographies? For instance, let's say, what can companies in Korea read from this research? Do you think their context and the applicability should still work, that it's global?
So we tried, that's a good question, thanks. We tried to make it applicable as widely as possible. And one of the ways of doing this was to choose companies, expert companies that are also diverse in terms of geographics. So we had companies from the US, we had a company from France, we had companies from Germany, we had a company from Italy, and some of the other companies were just multinational, so they worked all over the place, including like South Korea or Japan and China. So those companies, they had best practices that would work across the whole, all of their geographics of their companies. And so we thought that learning from them, this could help us make our findings also applicable. I can't say for sure how applicable it will be, because when we did the evaluation, we worked mainly with German companies or Germany-based companies that are international, but still, you know, the culture is quite German there. And this was the reason, because we had good access to them and we could work with them more closely to observe how it's working. So I can say that based on the data that we used to build our theory, to build our handbook, it should be applicable, but we tested it in German context and the European context more broadly. So there I can say for sure it will work, but more broadly, that would be a speculation. And I think it would work, but we haven't tested it.
Well, we certainly can't fault you for being practical and focusing on what was to hand in terms of real world knowledge. All righty. So those on the line, do you have any questions for Nikolay about the research and its outcomes or its meaning? Again, just remember you're on mute, so you'll need to unmute to talk.
Good afternoon, Nikolay. Quick question. Hopefully you can hear me.
Yeah, it's Jim, right?
Yes, thank you. So looking at this, I can certainly see if you have a large company that this would provide certainly a structure for thoroughness. If you're a smaller supplier trying to insert yourself into this process, are there things that you would naturally want to carve out or opt out of to still achieve the goal while maybe just attending to one narrow slice?
Yeah, that's definitely, you're right. If you're a smaller company, you would not have this huge process with a bunch of very complicated processes going around and lots of roles involved. And this is something we found while we were doing the research also, because some of the companies we worked with were small, like 20 people companies, consultancies, or there were also smaller suppliers that we talked to. And they usually did not have a large documentation or some guidelines, but they had the essentials covered, like how do you deal with the with the component tracking, how do you deal with documenting the licenses, scanning the components that you're getting, using some type of format like SPDX to manage the bill of materials that you're having and you have to supply to your customer. So this type of things they had to do, but many other things they didn't. So what I would recommend for such companies to do would be to look at the getting started part of my results, and that's the first appendix there in my dissertation. You can see how do you get started and what are the very essential things that you have to set up in the beginning. And once you have this, then you can look at other things and see which ones apply to your company more and which ones are less important, even though most of the things we found are important, but you can implement it to different degrees. So that would be my recommendation, to look at the getting started part, do those, and then beyond that, it also depends as a supplier. One thing we found is it depends on who you're working with, who your customer is. Sometimes your customer would ask for specific things to be done as a supplier, for example, to fill in some form about the open source components that you want to use in the software that you will supply later on. And this is obviously something you would have to deal with. But this is not the best practice we found. So you'll have to look at the getting started things and then work with your actual customers to see if they have some special requirements. Hope I answered your question. If not, you can ask a follow-up.
No, thank you. That's definitely helpful.
All right, thank you.
All
Other questions?
Yeah. Any further questions? Remember, you're on mute, so unmute if you have a question or comment.
Well, if not, you can always ask me by email or, just write me and we can chat.
I think it's pretty great that your full research is available for everyone to have a look. And in particular, I think this call is recorded, and when our Asian community gets a chance to look at what we've done today, your presentation today, I think they'll probably also head off to pick up your documentation. I know that in Japan and in Korea and in China, there are forthcoming meetings. So it's possible that this presentation will be replayed at those meetings.
Perfect.
Yeah. I just noticed one person came off mute. Mary came off mute. Do you have a question?
Yeah, simple question. Can the link to your full dissertation, would it be possible for you to put that into the chat window so I don't have to type that whole thing in?
Sure, I can do that.
Okay. And then one other, just a logistics thing. Can you put the Zoom info onto the OpenChain page?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
For those of you who had some difficulty coming into the room, by the way, before we got started, it turns out that even with the option for the password to be off, Zoom is now forcing a password. So our room was showing no password, but indeed it wasn't working.
You've noted the Zoom bombing issues, I'm sure.
Yeah, I did. Though I was sort of hopeful that with the setting to off, people could just dial in with no friction, but yeah, didn't work out.
Oh, those would be bad people.
And we did go for the most secure password in the world with 123456. No one will ever guess that.
Well, they'd have to know it was 6 digits at least.
True. True. All righty. Any further questions for Nikolay? All right. If not, we're going to switch over to Armin Hemmel. I think Armin is not going to be using slides today, but rather will be doing an audio presentation on container compliance. This is a topic that is more nitty-gritty, where Nikolay gave us the big overview on supply chain governance. This is going to be a specific dive into how one thing, containers, can have a compliance issue addressed. For those of you who've been following for the last couple of years, you'll be well aware that people like Dirk at VMware have been talking about container compliance and the challenges therein. Armijn Hemmel is well positioned to give us some light, Sean, on the topic, given his background in open source compliance. Indeed, he's one of the most experienced figures in the world. Armijn, you're currently on mute, but I'm going to hand over to you to talk through some of the key points with container compliance and why the OpenChain community should think about it and how they should think about it. And everyone, as before, we'll do Q&A at the end, but you can jump in at any time.
All right, can you hear me, Shane?
Perfectly.
Good. So yeah, you said a little bit about it being nitty-gritty, but I'm actually going to do more of a high-level overview of definitely a nitty-gritty subject. I think that if we could spend a week just talking about container compliance, and I'm not sure if that even would be enough. So my journey with container compliance actually started 4 years ago. I was at a conference in China, and Abbott Moglen was there, and he said, "It's going to be very busy for us in compliance land." And I said, "Why?" He said, "Docker files." And I didn't understand it at the time. Turns out that he was probably a little bit too early, but he definitely was right, because there's a lot more attention about Docker and Docker compliance and all that. So a lot of more people have picked it up, because Docker has made it a lot easier to to deploy software. So it has picked up a lot of steam. For those of you who used to work as a system administrator, I know you're on the call, Alexios. So they know that it has made it a lot easier than before, when you had to install your own machine, load software onto it, then boot it, maintain it, and so on. And now you just basically spin up a container. So the idea behind containers, that you can have software and all of their dependencies, all of its dependencies in basically in a containment, a contained environment, is very powerful. The thing is with Docker is that, in my opinion, it is a little bit chaotic. And when you're looking at the implementation details and see how software is, or how containers are created, it's, well, if you're doing compliance, then you're basically, your skin starts to crawl, because you can see that stuff is pulled from all kinds of directions and from all kinds of sources, and is then combined in a non-deterministic way. So you could run it one time, and then 5 minutes later you could run the same command again, and you would get something else, because the upstream has changed its layers, for example. So that makes it a little bit chaotic. And then trying to find out, when you're shipping a container or a Docker file, like, what is in there? What am I shipping? Where am I getting that stuff from? What's the provenance? Those are all questions that are not so easy to answer. So, of course, Turn from VMware has already done a good job in trying to determine part of that problem, but there are a few other things as well. So I've been working on researching container compliance a little bit, and what I found out is that if you can do this compliance all by hand if you want to, because the things like the on-disk representation of Docker containers, it's not that difficult. It's basically lots and lots of tar files. So each layer is a tar file, and then you can reconstruct how everything is combined. But it's a lot of work, a lot of bookkeeping. So things like OpenChain definitely help you there, because they are giving you a framework to operate within. As said, you can do it, but you can do it without a framework, but doing it within a framework makes things so much easier. So a few things that I've identified is in my research is that there's a little bit of confusion about licenses. So it might be best to step back a little bit and then see how containers are basically constructed. What mostly happens is that a person gives you a so-called Docker file. Then you basically say, well, you know, go create this container image. Software gets downloaded from the internet, and a set of layers is constructed, and then from that you can instantiate a container, a running container. Those files are, the Docker files are basically descriptions or recipes, and they can come under their own license. So what I've seen is that some people are mistaken, they are mistaking the license of the Docker file itself with the license of the contents of the layer, so a Docker layer, which confuses people. So they say, well, you know, I only have MIT stuff in here because here it says license MIT. And said, well, you know, but you're also pulling in this entire Debian image with lots of GPL3 software in it. And explaining that is challenging. So although the recipes are often very short or can be very short, there's a lot going on in the background, and a lot of software is pulled into from sources that people often do not realize that. So that's, again, why you need to do a lot of bookkeeping. So that's one of the issues. Then another one is how can you actually get the right source code of what you're, when you're creating a recipe, or when you're creating a container image. Sorry, here it's the after dinner dip, so my brain is a bit foggy. But basically, when you're constructing a image and you're pulling software, how can you make sure that you are getting the right source code for the stuff that you're pulling from the internet? And right now, this is an unsolved problem. If you're looking into Docker, so the Docker software itself, then there's a lot of stuff there that you can say, you know, I want to have this specific layer, or I want to pull this, and I want to do this command, and I want to do all kinds of stuff. But when you're saying like, okay, I want to be able to fully get all of the sources of this particular layer that I'm getting from a repository, then you're out of luck. There are currently no mechanisms there which allow a user pulling a layer from a repository to get all of the source code, and also not to allow a user that is pushing a layer to a repository, so basically publishing a layer on a repository, to also include all of the complete and corresponding source code without going through a lot of hoops. I mean, you can probably add everything to the layer and then push it, but that is a little bit silly. So that is something that the technology currently does not allow. It's basically very much about deployment, not about compliance. So that is one thing. The other one is, so there are also various ways of distributing layers, let me try to find the right words. Shane, why don't you ask a smart question?
Yeah, I actually got what might be a doozy. Is this governance issue with containers inherent to the design of containers, or is it just this particular type of implementation? Because it seems like a heck of a governance challenge, and it doesn't seem like it's a solved problem yet.
No, I would agree. I don't think that it is inherent to containers itself, but and it could be an implementation issue. But if you're looking at it from a system administrator's point of view, you're basically mostly caring about the deployment and making sure that everything is up and running nicely and is governed, and not about, you know, do I actually have all of the correct source code for this container, or can I actually get it? That's not in the system administrator's mindset. I used to work as one, so I know. So that definitely, yeah.
I've got a follow-up on that one, which is that, let's say that these images, Docker images or Open Container Initiative images, are particularly focused on deployment itself. Are you aware of real-world cases where, let's say, the deployment-first architecture, not governance-first architecture, has led to substantial real-world challenges for companies?
You mean legal challenges?
Yeah, basically in our context, I'd go with legal challenges, or, you know, it could be something that hits people reputationally as well.
No, I'm not aware of any of them. The thing is that there are one extra complication is about what is actually distributed. So in the regular use case, people are actually distributing only a recipe file, a so-called Docker file. And then, so if I would distribute an image to you, I would give you the Docker file. And then you would assemble the Docker container image on your own machine. So the Docker software on your system would interpret all these commands and pull all kinds of stuff from the internet. And as Dirk has shown in talks that he has given at conferences, very often that means also downloading a random binary from a GitHub repository, so that which is a little bit scary. And but basically everything is in the regular use case is happening on your machine, and it's software is being pulled from the internet. So that is the most common use case. Then there's also another use case where you can basically say someone, here's the complete container image with all of the layers, which I basically saved from my running Docker instance, and that you can now load onto your Docker instance. And then you have all of the layers with all of the software. And that is more like the regular distribution of software. So for example, if I would give you a CD, then I could also just say, like, you know, here are all the layers of my container image. But that is not the regular use case. The regular use case is that I'm just giving you the recipe and your machine is executing all of the commands. So then when it comes to, are you actually distributing software then? Or are you just distributing a recipe? Who's doing distribution? So in that context, Docker is a little bit, in the regular use case, Docker is different than most of the other distribution. It's not distribution of software, it's distribution of a recipe. And then your machine is interpreting that recipe and downloading stuff from repositories. So then you have the whole question like, who's doing distribution? Is it the people who push the layers to the repositories? Do they have to do compliance? Well, they're technically not distributing to you directly. It's the repositories, but maybe the repositories are more like content delivery networks. They're just passing things on. Are they doing distribution? Maybe, maybe not. So these are a lot of the unanswered questions that we have right now. Like, who's doing the distribution? Is it the person writing the recipe? I don't think so. Is it the person who pushed the layers to the repository? Maybe. Is it the repository that you're downloading from? Maybe. So those are the interesting questions that you bump into when you're doing stuff with Docker.
Gosh, it does seem like we have a bit of digging to do here. Now I noticed.
Well, yeah, and that's why you need a framework, because it can get very complex.
Yeah. I noticed a couple of people are unmuted. So we've got Alexius and Thomas and Jim unmuted. Does anyone have a question for Armin at this juncture?
I think I exposed Alexios as a sysadmin.
No, forget my old sysadmin hat, but I just wanted to point out that all this is being heavily worked on and discussed on the wonderful tooling group that we have. And the next call is going to be this Wednesday, and we have 2 calls, and feel free to come by and join us, because that's exactly what we're talking about all this stuff. And I can put a link to our repository that we have put some information about container compliance with flows, all these things that Armind explained very well, that you can either distribute or your Docker file or your full layer or your full image and glossaries and all this stuff. So yeah, if you have nothing better to do on Wednesdays, please join us.
And Alexius has alluded to the bi-weekly tooling group calls, and it's a very active part of OpenChain. I mean, it sounds fairly ambitious when we said, oh, we're going to have bi-weekly webinars, but we already have schedules like that on things like tooling. And I have to give a call out to everyone involved in the tooling work group. It's just been superb how much information is flowing. In fact, I was talking with Oliver today and saying, you know, some of the future webinars here will probably be deep dives into things that were discussed on the tooling group, so we can make sure everyone globally has them. All righty. Any further questions for Armin at this juncture?
Shane, I can make a remark on
Yeah.
on so you were asking about real life incidents.
Yes.
So I can do two remarks. So one, what I'm seeing is that more enterprise software is being distributed as a Docker image. So the traditional things, but the companies that are distributing it are usually mid-size or startup, and they have no idea what it means. They're now basically distributing a big chunk of Linux with it. So yeah, especially watching the enterprise software, your common web applications that you normally use inside your company, those are moving to Docker images, because again, it makes deployment so much easier. On the incident side, what you see, that Docker is not designed as a technology at all for compliance, at all. It's a deployment technology. And as such, it also doesn't take proper care of not only for license compliance, it's not only about sourcing, but also about security. So there have already been some incidents, for instance, in OpenJDK, where the Docker images, so that when you have a recipe, it pulls mostly in those image formats from Docker Hub. Now, the issue is that unlike with the distributions, Docker Hub has no verified account. So somebody just registered an account in the name of OpenJDK. Everybody thought it was the OpenJDK maintainers that was maintaining that account on Docker Hub. It was not. And when people were using that particular image, they were getting an OpenJDK that was not the official released version, but a modified version. And it was only until a security researcher found out that basically like, hey, how can an OpenJDK release be made on Docker Hub a couple of days before the official OpenJDK release goes out? So there have already been several security incidents on basically, because again, there's no unlike the Linux distributions where there is a verified chain, the maintainers that maintain the distro know how to do this. Now all the package management is now being handled by developers that do not necessarily have the experience to do this. And the training that, if you look, for instance, at the Debian guys, they know how to do this stuff. They know how to keep licenses. They know how to update it. All of that is now gone to regular developers. So yes, there have already been some incidents. Unfortunately, I'm not allowed to talk about some of these, but yeah, they're in my circles. We already have been familiar, not necessarily about license compliance, but mostly about security, because literally in Docker, you can pull anything from the internet, and it's a continuously changing, fast changing chain, and it has none of the securities that you have in a normal Linux distribution. So that's basically my remark.
Thomas, that's really good. In some ways, it sounds very similar to the NPM problem, right?
Yeah, it's very similar. It's basically what we're moving to is highly dynamic ecosystems that continuously change. NPM is of course on the utmost scale of it. As me being a node developer myself, everything changes continuously in NPM. That is not necessarily always the case in Docker, but again, the change frequency is much higher. And there's, at least in NPM, when they designed NPM, there are some minimum things that they have built in that keep some traceability. It's not perfect. You have none of that in Docker. Like, none of that.
For anyone who's unfamiliar with NPM, it's a very interesting way to deliver packages. And the challenge with NPM is that, one, you're not sure who's behind the packages. And two, it's entirely possible that someone could remove their package and then you find that thousands of applications are dependent on it, which has happened. Though from our perspective, we're interested in how Docker is potentially a compliance challenge. And
Shane,
Thomas,
there's actually a third problem with NPM.
oh yeah, go.
You can publish to NPM without making the sources available. There's no security check whatsoever.
That adds spice. It just makes things entertaining. It prevents you getting bored, especially in quarantine times.
Luckily, GitHub now bought NPM, so hopefully they will start cleaning up things.
So related to this, Armand, I don't want to jump the gun too much on official PR, but I believe that there's an article or a document coming out by yourself related to this topic.
That is correct. Yeah. So for Linux Foundation, I've been working in the last year or so on trying to dig really into Docker and to see where we can find legal issues. So we are currently brushing that up, making sure that we've got some pretty pictures as well. And then the only thing that's left to do is basically the pretty pictures and also the formatting. And then it should be released through Linux Foundation. I'm not sure if it will only be for Linux Foundation members or not. So I don't know, but I can ask.
It'll be good to put more triage on this. And for those of you who haven't had a chance to see Dirk give one of his talks about container compliance, we'll probably do a webinar with Dirk down the line if he's willing. Alrighty, just checking if anyone has any questions. Bear in mind you are on mute, so you'll have to unmute to ask a question. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Armand. As we begin to wrap up this webinar, our first webinar, I want to thank everyone who came. We had 47 on the line earlier. We're now at 53 on the line minus Armand and myself. Thank you for your time. This webinar has been recorded and will be made available globally. We'll be having another webinar in 2 weeks. That one will feature 2 more speakers. We're going to have Maggie Wang from the law firm Lattice and Perry. Maggie's in charge of their China activities, and she's going to be talking to us about the current status in China with regards open source compliance and governance, and also the developments around OpenChain in China. Second speaker on that call will be Michael Cheng from Facebook, who's going to give us a deep dive into the Facebook OpenChain case study. This will be building on similar material he's talked about in the past at a few conferences, but this will be a rather unique situation where we can go back and forth live. So on the third Monday at 5 p.m. Pacific, our second webinar will take place with Maggie Wang covering China compliance and OpenChain, and Michael Cheng covering the Facebook experience around compliance and OpenChain. Everyone, thank you very much for your time. I look forward to seeing you again soon. I'll be doing some extra outreach and advocacy about how to dial in to the second webinar, making sure that everyone has the right link to start with and has the password to start with as well. Big thanks to our friends at Zoom, and despite some hiccups with things like the new lockdown on the calls, I think this went pretty well, and I really appreciate your time. Take care all, stay safe, and talk to you soon.